You're listening to Sunday Morning with me, Cathy MacDonald, here on BBC Radio Scotland. Victoria Amelina was a celebrated Ukrainian writer who turned to documenting war crimes after the Russian invasion 3 years ago. Tragically, she was killed before finishing her book, Looking at Women, Looking at War. Now, thanks to her friends, her work is being published. Earlier last week, I spoke to journalist and author Jen Stout, who knew Victoria personally and who told me what she was like as a friend and as a writer.
She was an extraordinary mixture of stubbornness, determination, self-deprecating humour. She was very good at that. You know, the thing that sticks out for me in my memories of her is this one picture actually that she posted online. She was in Kherson not long after the liberation of Kherson. And there's a thing that happens in war especially, but in journalism generally where, and I don't want to upset people, but particularly male reporters tend to have these profile pictures of them in black and white in their flak jacket looking into the far distance, looking very serious. And I do find it quite funny. And she had the opposite. It was her in this ill-fitting helmet, because one of the things about war reporting is that none of the stuff fits us, you know, if you're quite a small woman. And her helmet's all squint and she's in Kherson and she's pulling her face kind of like, oh, what am I doing here? What, you know, isn't this all a bit mad? And she kind of took that irreverence and humour to all of her work, even though the work she was doing was the bleakest, grimmest thing you can imagine. So she became a war crimes researcher, although she had been a novelist and a writer, because she thought it was important.
Small, but fearless, clearly. And her life took a dramatic turn after the Russian invasion, of course. Can you tell us about how she went from being a novelist to a war crimes investigator, and why?
She wrote to someone in Ukraine who was very influential. She was working with truth hounds. And this is when there was an acknowledgement that we needed to be gathering evidence to a legal standard with the hope and belief that there would be a tribunal, that there would be justice, and that we needed to document every single atrocity that Russians had committed in Ukraine, from the airstrikes on civilian buildings to the torture cells. I mean, the list is endless, almost, Cathy. And she believed that this was her role, that she could use words to achieve justice, documenting and recording all these testimonies. I'll quote the book a little bit here. She says, the quest for justice has turned me from a novelist and mother into a war crimes researcher. Over the last year, I've photographed shell holes in library walls and the ruins of schools and cultural centres. I've recorded the testimonies of survivors and eyewitnesses of atrocities. I've done this to uncover the truth, ensure the survival of memory, and give justice and lasting peace a chance. And she interviews the lawyer and writer Philippe Sands, who wrote East-West Street, about these two Lviv lawyers who really coined the terms crimes against humanity and genocide. And it's an astounding read, because we forget, or I didn't realise, that before Nuremberg, before those trials and before these lawyers came up with these terms, there was no way to try these kind of crimes. There was no way to achieve that justice. But then we got the International Criminal Court, then we had this justice. And that was very fragile. And my fear, and a lot of people's fear, and I think Vika's fear as well, is that is disappearing. So there's this really poignant bit where she's walking through the city of Lviv, the beautiful streets of Lviv, and she's very tired. She's been, in the beginning of the war, she worked in a humanitarian aid centre distributing aid. I raise my head and see the plaque dedicated to Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer who coined the term genocide. I stop. This plaque seems out of place. It belongs to another story about achieving justice, acknowledging the truth and saying never again. All of it is gone now, isn't it? And I read that, particularly this past week. I read that and it just struck me. Like she's speaking to us, you know, directly about what's happening now, because it was one thing that the international community would never really bother to help Ukraine enough. You know, there was a lot of thoughts and prayers and there was a small amount of weapons, but never enough. But really, we believed that there would be justice at the end of it, that things like this don't go unpunished. And to be honest, it's now looking unlikely because of what America's doing.
And it was women's perspective that was important to her. Why?
Well, I'm asked this a lot about my own book, and I think I didn't set out to write about women, and I'm not sure Victoria necessarily did. It's just that you end up meeting all these extraordinary women because they are so active in Ukrainian civil society, and that's been the case for a long time. They're kind of the backbone of things. But yeah, I mean, I think that perspective is important because they're often there doing the most diligent work and trying to manage almost impossible demands on them. So, I mean, Victoria had a son, and he was in Poland in safety, so she was seeing very little of him, and it was really, I mean, you see in this book just the kind of the daily pain that was causing her and the guilt as well. There's a bit where she takes out a Vyshyvanka, the Ukrainian shirt, and she gets her son's one, and she has this sort of gasp where she realises that she doesn't know his size anymore. So those kind of demands on your time that I think are much more harsh for women form a big part of that book, that kind of experience your life being in limbo and the pain of that.
And the book itself, obviously, it was unfinished when she was killed, and it blends writing, personal diary entries, historical references, witness testimonies, and her friends have completed the book, recognising her voice and what she would have wanted, but a huge responsibility too.
Yes, it must have been. They have an epilogue at the end explaining the approach they took with this. It's very difficult to know what to do with an unfinished manuscript, and parts of it feel so personal because they're like fragments of notes, unfinished sentences, little bits that she's jotted down. It feels really familiar because they're like a journalist notes. You know, she's like, oh, that guy at the railway centre, you've got to contact him, and all of that's in there. And I understand why they made that decision. It feels very personal. I think for her, she remembered every single person in such detail. They all meant so much to her. I remember interviewing her about Volodymyr Vakulenko, the writer who was killed. And she said, I've still got the acorn. She'd gone to his father's garden in this village called Kapitolivka to dig up the diary that Volodymyr had buried when he knew the Russians were coming for him. And she said, Jen, I've still got the acorn in my pocket, you know. She kept it. And those things, things clearly made such a big imprint on her, and she very keenly felt the responsibility of getting everything down on paper, of naming these people, of sitting and listening to them, and making sure their story was heard. An astounding sort of bit of this story is that Victoria was killed in an airstrike with cruise missiles on a pizza restaurant in Kramatorsk that I had eaten at. Everybody ate there. There's not many places to eat in Kramatorsk. And it was 7:00 in the evening. She was having dinner with some Colombian colleagues, and her colleagues at Truth Hounds at this NGO, they did their own investigation into her death to prove that it was itself a war crime. And it's 80 pages, and they found the person responsible. And this is really important. It was the 47th Missile Brigade of Russia's 8th Combined Arms Army, commanded by Colonel Vitaly Bobyr. He issued that order, and he is responsible for that war crime that killed her.
She often spoke about the tragedy of Ukrainian writers only gaining recognition through war and death. How does that sentiment resonate with you?
It's a tricky one. I remember when she died, it was on the bulletins, you know, it was on Radio 4, it was on Women's Hour, it was everywhere, and a few people were saying quite unkindly, you know, well, why is she more important than other people? And I kind of understand what you mean when you say, well, every life is of course equal value. But she was such a conduit. So not only was she documenting all this stuff, but she was so clever and so good at linking things together, explaining the sweep of history. She felt very keenly about explaining, especially to foreigners like me, the history of Russian colonialism, the way it all ties together, the impunity of the Soviet war crimes, and how that allows Russians to continue behaving in that way, because there was no, as she put it to me, there was no Nuremberg for the Soviet war crimes, only for the Nazis. And she could do this big historical sweep. And that was so important, to be a conduit to explain Ukraine to others.
Because, of course, for many of us, we would probably only know the history from 2022, whereas for her, she said, this didn't start with the Russian invasion on the 24th of February 2022.
No, and it didn't even start in 2014 with the first invasion. It didn't even start with Maidan a few years before that. You know, this is hundreds of years of the Ukrainian language being banned, of people being murdered. She wrote a lot about the executed Renaissance, the generation of the 1920s in Kharkiv in particular, who were mostly murdered by Moscow in the Gulag. This is all absolutely crucial if we want to actually understand what's happening, and particularly if we want to understand the moral aspect of this, right? It's so easy for people to say, oh, war, you know, it's terrible, and the conflict, it seems far away, I don't really understand it, it's all horrible, why can't they just stop it? Well, if you understand that history, you understand why they're fighting. And she was so good at explaining that. It's difficult to be optimistic, difficult not to be extremely angry about what's happening to Ukraine. Everything is on the shoulders of Europe now, and whether they can have some leadership and stand up for Ukraine, because this idea that you'd have all these atrocities, all these years of war and aggression without any justice at the end of it, that's unthinkable.
Author and journalist Jen Stout, to whom I spoke a few days ago, sharing her memories about the work of her friend, author and war crimes investigator Victoria Amelina, and Victoria's book, Looking at Women, Looking at War. It's out now. It's published by HarperCollins.